Let's start our first animation. We will animate position of this circle. So to see position, we can just select this circle and press P on keyboard. It will open position. Also, if you will not remember the shortcuts, you always can scroll here down and go to transform. Just make sure that you're going not into the contents, but in transform itself. And here we will animate this position property. It will allow us to animate whole shape as one. This is why it's really handy to remember the shortcuts. Then you will be able just to select your shape layer, press P for position, and animate position. And we will create our first keyframe. So to create our first keyframe, we want to click here on this stopwatch. So let's left mouse click on this stopwatch. It will create this diamond shape keyframe. And if we will select this time cursor and scroll to the first second, and then select our circle and just left mouse click and move up like this, you'll see that it drawn this trajectory as well as created a new keyframe. So what is keyframe? Keyframe is a point in time which remembers value of certain property. In our case, this keyframe remembered this point in time, which is first second. It remembers this value, which we've set, to this position property. And here at the 0 second, you can see that it remembered in this moment in time this value of position property. And now, just between these keyframes with different values, it goes from this value, which is 540, to this value, which is 238. But as you remember, we didn't change any values. We just move it vertically. So basically, this first value is x-axis, and this second value is y-axis. As you remember, we just move it up. So basically, only in y-axis. This is why this value changed. So basically, if we will change this value, you can see that we are moving it in y-axis. And if we will change this first value, we will move it in x-axis. So let's repeat one more time. We can just select these keyframes and delete it. So now as you can see, we don't have any animation. We will just set our shape into the middle by using this aligned tool. And we can create first keyframe, which will remember this position. Then we will scroll to 1 second and just move it up. If you will hold Shift, it will allow us to move only in one axis. And in this way, we've created new keyframe. And now basically our software Adobe After Effects is trying to connect these two values. It remembers that it stays here, and in this point in time, it knows that it needs to be here. If we will scroll here to the 3rd second, we can move it to the right. And now as you can see, After Effects knows that it needs to be here at the start. Then at the 1st second, it needs to be here. And at the 3rd second, it needs to be here. This is basically how animation in this software works. And by the way, now you can see that we have a bit of problem. It doesn't really go in the straight lines. Because by default, After Effects is trying to make this round motion. And if you don't like this kind of motion, you can always select all of the keyframes, right mouse click on it, and go to Keyframe Interpolation. And here you can disable this default behavior, which is Auto Bezier. You can set to linear. And if we will click OK, you can see that it's set to this linear motion. But keep in mind that this keyframe interpolation is really good only if you want to have these straight lines. But in our case, you remember that we have this kind of straight line and then this circle movement, which, as you can see, is not a straight line. This is where you don't want to use this keyframe interpolation. This kind of motion is more advanced, and we will check in the next video. But for now, let's complete this kind of square kind of motion. So it goes 1 second here, then 1 second here, and at 3rd second we can move it down, and here we can go back to the original point. And if we will press 0 on numpad, we can see our first animation. So before we are going to go to this more complex stuff, I need to explain you a few things which you need to know before going in more complex and advanced kind of stuff. First of all, that you can change the speed between these movements. For example, I want this motion up to go a lot faster, and then this motion to the right a lot slower. So this is how you can do it. You can just select all of these keyframes, which comes after this animation, and move it to the left, which is basically makes this first animation a lot faster, because we only give 12 seconds for it to go. And then this second animation, we can make a lot slower by selecting all of these keyframes and moving it to the right. And in this way, we are allowing for this animation to go 2 complete seconds. So it would be a lot slower. And you might be wondering why we are selecting all of these keyframes before changing this spacing between keyframes. Basically, by selecting all of the keyframes, we are make sure that we don't change spacing between these keyframes. For example, we like this speed of animation here. So it's a good idea not just to select one of the keyframe and move it to the right, because we will mess up this kind of animation, which will go faster here. So I'm gonna press Ctrl Z. If we want to change only this first part of animation, we always want to select this first keyframe and all of keyframes which comes later, in order to not mess up other animation which we have. For example, this movement down we also will make slow, and this animation to the left we will make fast. So to make it fast, we will squish it the spacing between these two keyframes. And now if we will press 0 on numpad, you'll see that it goes up fast, then goes slower, here also slow, and here fast. So this is basically how you can change the timing of your animation. And if we will space these keyframes evenly, you'll see that this animation goes about at the same speed. Just keep in mind, if you want to have the same speed of animation, you also need to keep in mind which distance it travels. So here is a cool trick. If you want your animation to be exactly the same, you can zoom in into your picture and watch the distance between these small kind of frames. And if you will match this distance like this, as you can see, here is smaller distance and here is bigger distance. So we would need to change this last motion a bit, so it will look kind of the same. In this way, we are making this animation to go the same speed. So what do you want to take out from this class? Basically, now we know that we can move our shapes and change the speed and distance which it travels. And by changing the spacing between these keyframes, we can change the speed with which it travels, which is really cool. And if you still have a trouble with this, you would want to just go to first keyframe, delete all of these keyframes by selecting them and press delete to delete them. Or just by clicking here, it also will delete all of keyframes. And start small. Just create first keyframe, then go a few frames and create this kind of animation. And then play around with this speed. You will see that by pressing 0 on numpad, you have fast movement, and if you will spread out these keyframes more, you will get this slower movement. And once you are comfortable with this motion, you can just delete this keyframe and, for example, go up. And then we can create this square kind of movement. It's really important for you to take time and play around with this principle, so you would be comfortable with the change in the speed and animation. You can rewatch this video to understand it better, or try to animate a different kind of motion and try in your head to predict what kind of motion you will get as a result. Okay, in the next video we are going to make this animation with our circle goes around like this. See you in the next video.